So just before Shane pressed record there, we were talking about previous podcasts we did with Dr. Dan Van Den Hook. Um, Basically, Dan was saying for powerlifting coaches, powerlifting athletes to be opening quite close to their estimated 1RM. And me and John were kind of saying it was a pretty ballsy kind of scenario. And it's potentially the case, John, we could see linear transducers brought into the warm-up room, a sports scientist, a coach, and an athlete all huddling around a laptop trying to see what we're going to be hitting that day based off the velocity of a random warm up. What do you think of that?
I think that, listen, if you've ever watched, weightlifting, there is a team of specialists in the back for every athlete, right?
Yeah.
There's physical therapists, there are chiropractors, there are, all kinds of people surrounding the success of those athletes. As powerlifting continues to get more competitive, more mainstream, if it makes its way into the Olympics, all these things that we talk about, it's conceivable that there is a larger team supporting these athletes in the back and trying to have more predictive analysis around the performance of those athletes. As we start seeing the boundaries of human performance continue to get pushed, okay, we just saw at Raw Nationals this year, Austin Perkins, a 75 kilo lifter, do things that are not done necessarily in one or two weight classes up. It's amazing the performances that are happening, and that's going to continue to be a thing. So if we think about that for a moment, it makes sense to have more technology, to have more support staff, to have more people thinking through how to have competitive advantage. And you had mentioned a tactic that could potentially be useful of opening up heavier to really be pushing your competition. I mean, the way that most people open at meets now is somewhere between 88 to 91% as your conceived opener, and around 96%-ish for your second, and then whatever is left for your third attempt. And that is because of Matt Gary's influence, and he wrote the game day manual, and he is so successful for a reason. It is reliable, but there are other ways too. And if one is going to open at 95%, like you were talking about while we were on the break, and I haven't read the research study that you had mentioned earlier, and I'm looking forward to it, and I'm actually listening to your podcast as well. But if that's the tactic, well, you're going to push your competition. When your competition sees, so-and-so is opening up with this weight, that's 20 kilos heavier than my opener. Well, I better try to catch up, and that might lead people to try to open heavier, which might mean more misses. So there could be some opportunity to that to push your competition. At the same time, we also know that traveling for international competition can take a lot out of you. If you're trying to make weight, if you're not getting normal sleep, you're on different time zones, all that stuff impacts you. And, the predictability of the numbers that you had 1 week ago becomes less and less accurate. So to your point, could we start to see LPTs, linear position transducers, being thrown on, the bar? Heck, we see it being built into bars. You mentioned Alico having it built into a bar. I mean, that stuff's going to continue, in my opinion. And I think for a good reason. We want this to be a sport. Look, if you watch professional sports, there's all of this game day prediction, all of these analytics. There's all kinds of tracking software to look at movement patterns. Why shouldn't that happen in powerlifting, right? And as powerlifting gets more competitive and more popular, we should see those things happen, I think.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think if anyone is involved in sport, even at grassroots level, we were talking to someone there recently. I think it was Jason. It was Jason Tremblay from the Strength Guys, and me and Jason. I would like Jason. I've worked in strength and conditioning for a while, and Jason worked in strength and conditioning for a while. And like you said, with weightlifting as well, like people forget weightlifting is an Olympic sport. It's at the upper echelons of sport and in general. But people have background teams. If you're with a mediocre soccer team, rugby team, there's probably a dietitian, strength and conditioning coach, a physiotherapist, an athletic therapist. There could be a sports psychologist called in for cup
Hmm.
or knockout stages of competition. And I suppose with powerlifting, as money starts to come into the sport, we will start to see some real steps towards like what Dan is doing, maybe going a little bit against the rhetoric in powerlifting and kind of saying, well, look, this is what the data is saying. You can stand by your biases and drive on and do whatever you want. But even looking at Olympic weightlifting, I think if people have ever watched the Olympic weightlifting at the Olympics or kind of high level Olympic weightlifting competitions, it's not uncommon for people to go like 1 out of 3 in the
Hmm.
snatch, or what, like two, like if they have 6 attempts, they might get 3 of them. They get 50% of their attempts and they can still podium. And I think that's what's kind of maybe in terms of success. I think he was very key in making that distinction. That success for the parameters of their study, they didn't define as hitting a PR total or increasing performance. It's increasing position or standing in the field. And I suppose maybe psychology has a lot more of a role in that. And I suppose when you look at international comps, like you said there, performance can tank. It's very rare. You'll see an athlete come from far corners of the world, travel, time difference, circadian rhythms are out. You're maybe that beef you were eating at home is maybe a bit nicer quality than the beef you're eating when you're away. Maybe that bottled water isn't tasting as good. So all of these factors, like you said, they all play in.
You're tongue in cheek about that, but I actually had that happen to a lifter who was competing internationally. He, you know, just to, not throw him under the bus or where he was at, but, because I'm sure they have good food there, but it was an isolated incident. Let's call it an isolated incident. But he ate something and got a stomach bug from eating something, and he ended up having some issues, and that impacted his weight, and he ended up dropping 3 kilos below where we expected him to be, and performance was very variable at an international competition, and that stuff happens, and it's happened to a lot of people, people that you see them come out and you expect something different from them and you're like, whoa, what happened? I mean, that's the challenges of trying to predict performance, is that, we're human beings. And like, I'll tell this to lifters too, is like when we're prepping for a meet and we pull numbers off of estimated 1RMs, that data is only as accurate as that moment in time, right? So your squat 10 days out is only as accurate as the conditions that it's presented. Whatever body weight you're at, how your sleep was at the time, the equipment you were training on, the people that were around you, the music that you were listening to, how long you were taking between attempts, it's only as accurate as that scenario. When it comes time for competition and you have your 2 hour weigh in, you have to make sure that you've made weight. You have to make sure that you're eating the foods that you respond best to, right? That you can predict stomach comfort and all those things. And then you're warming up on different equipment. A lot of people are training now on combo racks, so it's different. But like when I got started in the sport, I know we wanted to talk about that. I mean, that wasn't a common thing. If you went to a gym and they had a combo rack, there was like 20 people around it because, there's one of them. Now it's like, hey, every barbell club's got like 5 of them, at least. So, that's another factor, is like, what kind of equipment are you training on? And I think when you look at all of those things, international competition is very challenging. If you perform really well, and you perform really well across the board on all disciplines, squat, bench, and deadlift, there was a lot of effort placed upon the athlete and their coaching team to engineer that success, between making sure that nutrition is taken into account, that the travel plans are organized in such a way that the athlete has a way to decompress before the meet, to be able to get into a rhythm. The assessment that is taken in the warm-up room, the diagnostic that is done to make sure that that athlete is performing the way that they ought to, all of those things are engineered a certain way. And I'll give you a quick example of this. Newton Chang at 2023 Raw Nationals, I had a chance to handle him for Mark Robb. The level of detail that Newton had to cut down to 56 kilo, the 56 kilo class, it was astounding. He works with Kedrick Kwan, and the level at which they were detailing every hour what was going to happen, it was amazing. But that is why Newton has the success that he does, because he has organized everything to predict performance. And even still, he had some challenges around the weight cut and being in prime time and how long he was going to be without nutrition. And so those are the kind of things to think about when you're competing at a very high level, is how do you in some way orchestrate or organize that success? And every competition is an opportunity to get better at that.
I think even when you get into the higher levels of performance, regardless of sport, I think you see it an awful lot in bodybuilding, I suppose, that if we go back to the 70s and 80s, where people would have said they lived like monks, they lived such kind of almost lives
Yes.
secular to those of normal people. But at professional sports, their lives are so controlled from when they wake up in the morning, they get on the pitch, they get into the gym, they piss into a cup, how hydrated are you? Right, that's yellow, come back to me in 15 minutes and make that clear. Everyone's eating at the same time, everyone's
Yep.
training at the same time. We're out of the gym, we're onto the pitch, you have 2 or 3 hours off, and then we're doing the same thing in the evening, and that is your life. And I suppose where powerlifting is a weird sport, because at our highest levels of our sport, we've no professionals really. So
Right.
even most of the guys and the girls that we have at the highest levels, they all have day jobs for the most part, or else they're coaches. So maybe they're still like, they still have odd working hours, or maybe they've other commitments outside that. But I think when you like Newton as an example there of someone, I think even being able to micromanage the day to that extent, while the overall performance, even if it wasn't micromanaged, mightn't have been the same, but that reassurance, that clarity that it gives you on the day, it completely removes stress. It completely removes any anxiety of, oh fuck, where am I going to be at 4 o'clock? What if I get hungry? Where will my food be? It's like, nope, you know. And I think as a coach, even it doesn't make a difference if it's at the lower levels or the higher levels. I think having that plan for an athlete is massively reassuring. And I think even for the newer competitors, we kind of discount that level of preparedness. We say, oh, you don't need to worry about that. That's an only thing for when you're down the line. I've had people on their first competition day be absolute nervous wrecks. And I think in hindsight, I could have managed that a little bit better by outlining the day, outlining the process a little bit clearer. And I suppose when we think about the higher levels of our sport, we kind of create a disconnect between the Newton Changs and I'm only picking my sister, for example. My sister did her first powerlifting competition 6 weeks ago.
Oh,
And
cool.
had only been resistance training for a couple of weeks before, but I probably could have done a better job of saying at 3 o'clock, at 4 o'clock, at 5 o'clock. And I think you kind of said it there yourself, where having that can be essential to the day.
Well, I know you guys wanted to chat about emerging strategies, and at RTS, we do emerging strategies bingo. So every time that we have a meeting, we try to count how many times we make an ES reference. And this is what we do like when we're together in person, by the way. So we do it all the time. But I'm going to make an ES reference right now. So if you think about emerging strategies as a system, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to simplify all the variables as much as we can and create consistency. Because if we have consistency and we're using a sort of scientific method in a way, we can help to analyze what are the actual variables that are driving performance in the direction that we want, and what are the things that are possibly detriments to performance. So if we control and we're looking at creating the same protocol every week. So let's just say I had you work up to a heavy set of 5, like I do with Shane. I have him working up to a heavy set of 5 in a training session, 5 out of 8. If we keep that consistent every week, we should see how that protocol results in a response for Shane and his training. If we change it every week, if it's 5s one week and triples the next and maybe singles, how do we know what's working? How do we know what was actually driving the performance. Because what we want to do is we want to use it again. We want this blueprint to say the next time that Shane's he's going to prepare for a competition, we want to do this at this time. The same is true for preparing for any type of meet. If you install a game day plan, a system, you want to be able to then tweak it. Well, the only way that you can tweak it is if you keep it consistent. Like I personally, like when I'm competing, I'll have certain foods that I'm eating. It's timed, right? Like I'm eating this exact food in this amount of quantity at this time, because that allows me then to then change it, to say, well, maybe I didn't want to have this, or maybe this was too much or too little. Maybe I didn't drink enough. Maybe I cramped a little bit. So it helps to create consistency. And I think that that's the way to go. That's the one learning I had at looking at like Newton's plan and how he organized himself. I said, that is a way to identify and really hone in on the variables to say, this is what I need to change next time to get the performance that I want. Just like with emerging strategies. If you want to know if a 2-count pause squat has good carryover to your comp squat, well, you got to do it. And you got to keep it there and keep it consistent. Because if you change it and it's high bar next week and SSB the next, well, how do you know? You don't really know. Now, I think that one of the things when we talk about emerging strategies is we think that it has to be sort of this, it's this method. Instead, I would tell you that it's more of like a way to gather information. It's a system to gather information. So really what it comes down to is a couple of things. It's creating a really good training week that you can do over and over and over again until it no longer benefits you. So I try to simplify it when I talk about what emerging strategies is. And I say it's really just a training week repeated, right? It's don't change the exercises, don't change the rep ranges, keep the stress the same. And it's got to be one that you recover from, right? It's got to be something that you can go into the next week and not feel completely, beat up. That being said, some people respond where they get better every single week, whereas some athletes, maybe they'll dip down a little bit in week 2, like I do, and then weeks 3, 4, 5 continue to go up. But part of it is simplifying things into a really good training week and repeating it so that you can identify those variables, because that's really the only way. Another example that I can give is if we go back to, preparing for a competition. Well, if in the warm-up room, you suddenly change the way that you warm up to a top single, does that institute more fatigue? What about on, bench? You just take a bunch more singles than you normally do than you did in training. Well, does that institute some fatigue? If you miss your third attempt, is it because you had the wrong number in for the day, or is it because you fatigued yourself? And that's the benefit of creating consistency. So what I try to do when I work with athletes to create good development cycles in emerging strategies is I try to identify what are the things that we think drive the best performance for you. Start off with the basics. How many times a week do you think that you can squat and come back and feel like you can do it again? Some people it's 3, some people it's 2, some people it's 1. Very rarely do I get 4 or 5. There are out there, but identifying frequency. And then we figure out movements, and then we figure out intensities and sort of stress. And the intention there is to try to create repeatability in training, just like we would do if we wanted to compete and be at our best. We need to create predictability and reliability.
I think you said something there, John, that I suppose maybe it might be worthwhile clarifying for people. What do you mean by repeatability? I think I might have an idea in my head of what you mean by repeatability, but I think for a lot of people there's an assumption that repeatability just means coming into the gym and doing the same thing the next day or next week. So maybe what do we mean by repeatability and what do we mean by reliability?
Great question. So when we think about reliability, part of that, we have to come to terms with the fact that we are an ever-changing person. So whenever we do a development block, at the end of it, we should be different. So we should be able to handle certain loads differently. We should have different technique. We should have different ways of organizing ourselves when it comes to movement. And so one thing to keep in mind is that it's a constantly shifting landscape. So Mike Teixeira, who popularized he created emerging strategies and, popularized it. One of the things that he says, and I think it's a great analogy, is that imagine you're trying to discover a cave with a flashlight, and that's what coaching and emerging strategies is like. You're trying to uncover the cave, except the cave is constantly shifting. So we have to come to terms with that. I say that constantly, is that, so I actually had a lifter who gave me a really good quote at the end of a development block. He said, after every development block, I'm a new man. And that's the challenge, is that I'm a new man after every development block. And that I think is a good way to look at it. You are a different person. You're a different lifter. So we have to come to terms with that and say, after every block, we will be different. But when we use a stimulus and we write a really good training week and we write a good microcycle that we can repeat over and over again, even if time passes and we come back to it, let's say 3-6 months, we come back to that protocol and those movements and those stresses. If we do it again and we see a similar result, there's some type of magic there. There's something that's important to the lifter. Now, that could be technically based. That could be what I like to call effective intensity. So let's just say that we find that 70-80% intensities are really good for you as an athlete. There's something about it that is developmental to you. And we can come up with all these heuristics on why that could be, but it almost doesn't matter. What matters is that you respond to it. So if I gave you this development block today, and then in 6 months I gave it to you again, and we see a similar response, there's something about it. So that's what I mean about predictability, is we can feel reasonably certain if we do it again that this is going to be your sort of greatest hits. And then there's the repeatability. Repeatability to me is looking at a really good training week that we can repeat again and again. So if I give you a really hard training week, one that is above, and I'll use a term that we're probably familiar with and your audience is familiar with, maximum recoverable volume. I like to think about it as stress, maximum recoverable stress. If I give you a training week that is at the tippy top of that, or potentially above it, is that really repeatable every week? Probably not. I mean, maybe if you controlled every little bit of sleep and stress, and you had said it earlier, Lawrence, that, we're not paid full-time athletes. Like, we have lives, we have jobs, we have family, we have all these other things. I mean, it's hard to get exactly 8 hours of sleep every single night. It's hard to get exact with your macros and to get exact with these sort of things and make sure you get all of your accessories in, every little bit of it. It's hard to do. I'm not saying it's impossible and that people don't, but it is really hard. So what I tend to do is set stress that's slightly under that, because I don't think that it's repeatable for someone to be at that level of stress all the time. So I kind of think of it as like, here's your run rate. This is the level at which, if we repeat this stress, you're going to get better at a rate that we're happy with. We can go higher than that, and we'll probably get more stress and more performance. But we may not be able to set up camp and live there for a while. Does that make sense? We might be able to do it for 1 or 2 blocks. Below that is probably a stress and a performance improvement that's the least acceptable. If you have an athlete, let's say that you predictably see a 15 kilo increase from the start of their development block to the end, and we lower the stress and they get a 7. Well, maybe 7's acceptable if they have high levels of work stress in their life or family stress and things like that. Maybe they're okay with that because at that time, the landscape is presenting such that that's the best you're going to get. But for the rest of the year, we want to be close to that 15 kilo increase. We probably want that stress. But then maybe let's just say that there's this other place that we can go with stress, where we go from 80% to, let's say, 100%, on the volume knob. And we turn that, and now we get 20 kilos rate of gain. Except knees start to get a little cranky. You get some niggles in the shoulder. You know that the wheels are about to come off, okay? You're about to break all the seals in your engine. Use whatever car analogy you have. That's probably good before a very important meet where you really need to push it, or at a time that's really important, but you probably don't want to be running the engine that long there. You probably don't want 7,000 RPM all the time. you probably want to be dialed back lower. And that's the kind of thing when it comes to stress. So we want reliability and predictability. Reliability in that we can do this thing and get a good performance, predictability so we know approximately how much we're going to gain, be able to come back to this strategy in a few months and be able to use it again, and it's going to give us a good performance. But we also want to be able to repeat this strategy week in and out for a while to get that predictable performance at the end.
No, that's brilliant. I think where us as coaches, I suppose, an awful lot of the underpinnings of that process, it needs to be heavily individualized, and you need to have very, very good communication with your athlete to actually be able to foster enough of a relationship where you can say, look, you're not going balls to the wall here for a couple of months. We're committing to this. And like, even for me, I find where you're saying to the athlete is saying, oh no, I can push this now a little bit more, I can push this a little bit more. And it's like, well, look, pal, there's a time and a place. And I think it's probably one of the things that's kind of hardest as a coach maybe to say to your athletes, that if you're burning the candle at both ends from an intensity or load perspective and a volume perspective, we get these fluctuations in performance that if you're randomly adding, if we're programmed for sevens and you're randomly going up here to eights and nines, predictability in that performance, it's the performance across time is what we're looking at. That when you take the lens and you pull back, and we're not saying all the way back to where we're okay, here was you 6 weeks in newbie, but we're trying, like you said, to look at that performance throughout the entirety of the block, and we might have little peaks and troughs throughout it. Like you said there, you might get a dip in performance for a week or two early on, but we can kind of predict it. You'll go relatively linearly throughout, but when people have the outside stress of training, and then we're randomly throwing additional training stress in on top of it, that's when we run into issues.
That's the one thing that I think about a lot is, what are the guardrails that I have with this athlete?
Yeah.
I actually find it really difficult, and I've heard Mike say this too, that if you have an athlete that comes to you and says, hey, Lawrence, I can train 6 days a week, 7 if you tell me to, 6 days a week, I'll train 4 if you want me to, 5 hours a day, I can squat as many times a week as you want, I get 10 hours of sleep a day, and my macros to the gram, I'm good, tell me what's the best program for me. I find that is the hardest person to work with.
That's the worst.
Because you have no guardrails. Yeah. Like you have no idea what the upper limit is for that kind of an athlete, you know? And then, you don't, like, you could throw a program out to them and completely destroy them, or give them a program that is just not remotely enough. It's just a drop in the bucket. I find those are the most challenging athletes to work with. I actually find the athletes that are easier to work with are the ones that are like, hey, listen, man, I've got 4 days a week to train. I've got 2 hours in each training session, and I can only squat twice. What do? That's where I feel like having those guardrails is really important. And I think that if you're a self-coached athlete, it's really hard because you've got to try to figure that out. I'm going through like a self-coached athlete experimentation right now. I have a couple of ideas in my head that I want to play with, and it's super difficult to say like, all right, John, don't just add another 2-3 sets. What are you doing? Like, you've got to rein it in. You've got these guardrails for a reason. You need this frequency of squat. You know that this is the upper limit of stress for you. So let's kind of figure out where we want to be with that. And I think that's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing as a coach. It's a hard thing if you're a self-coached athlete. And coming back to our analogy before, that landscape is constantly changing.
I think where I always draw parallels between programming maybe in a lot of these considerations is if you take an almost games approach to it. And I know that sounds really funny to think of it that way, but if you think about games, the hardest games to play are where there's less rules. So when we look at games, that's why we have rules in the game, because if this happens, we have this rule. If this happens, we have this rule. And I always think about programming kind of in that way, that when someone's coming to you with a list of parameters or a list of like maybe a little bit of history, that's really, really easy to deal with. It's the blank canvas is the hard one. The person that's saying, I can do everything. I'm living the life. I hit my macros. I, like you said, I sleep 12 hours a day. You're kind of sitting there and you're nearly scratching your head. You're kind of going, well, what can't you do is the hard part.
I truly agree with you. That is a great analogy. And I think that if you don't have rules, if you don't have those guardrails to work with, how do you stay? How do you know what's your lane? And when you're drifting off out into the shoulder of the road, and whatever analogy you want to use, like you need to know that, because it helps contain you and contain your effort. And the same is true when it comes to stress and designing training. And that's, I think, to me, the underpinning behind emerging strategies is to be, look, we want to push it every week as much as we can, reasonably as much as we can. We need to recover from that work. We need to come back and we need to do it again until it stops working. And then we need to analyze, what is it that we need next? And we need to take good notes so that we can come back and see what are the things that are the best for us. And I think at its simplest, that's literally what emerging strategies is. So what I do with my athletes is I will design the block, kind of write it out, have them execute, wait until they get the best that they're going to be in that block, meaning their estimated 1RM or their performance gets the best. And then usually it falls off a cliff after. And if you kind of wait for that, which is, by the way, a really hard sell, you know what I'm saying? Like, imagine, like, you know, it was very difficult for me when I started with Shane to be able to say, hey, listen, Shane, we're going to do this thing and eventually your E1RM is going to tank, but that's okay. You know, Shane, what was that like for you when we first started working together and performance was like, boop?
Yeah, I suppose at the time, considering our first development block was during a period where I was probably drinking a little bit too much alcohol for any athlete drinking. It was almost to be expected, but yeah, it is a hard one to go from maybe being able to add a little bit of weight every week to the bar to like all of a sudden a weight that you crushed the week before to be crushing you. So, but like that's part of the experiment process with going through emergent strategies, right? Is to try to find out how long it takes for you to reach that like top end strength, but that's ultimately contributing towards better information for like future blocks.
Exactly. And that's what Mike calls your time to peak. And you're basically getting to peak condition is considering that if we gave you the same variable every single week, eventually it's just going to stop being beneficial. And from there, we need to give you a new challenge, something new for you to overcome. And if you think about that for a moment, that for you might be 5 weeks. For me, it might be 6. Lawrence, for you, it might be 8. Whatever that is, why would we cut off something that you're benefiting from? Like, why would we just artificially decide, hey, let's switch it up? So that's one of the first things that I do with athletes is to try to identify that. And then it's like, we need to repeat this thing. And then we need to identify what's the next thing you need. And that's where it gets a little bit more tricky, is to say, okay, we just did this block of 5s and, you know, Shane, you know, performed very well. Does that mean we go to a block of 3s? Or do we stick with something that's higher rep range? Like, what is it that he needs? And part of that is, so another point I wanted to bring up is the coach and athlete relationship. I value so much the ability to come alongside an athlete and collaborate with them. So I think to do emerging strategies right, and Lawrence, you said this earlier, that like it comes down to athlete and coach partnership, and it comes down to like really being in tune with your athlete and having that conversation. It has to be individualized. It's the only way. That's why it's so difficult to systematize and put a bunch of people in like a group and do emerging strategies with them, because it's like, imagine, hey, I want to try to give training to the same people, except you've got an 8-week time to peak and you've got a 5-week time to peak. How does that work? Right. So that's why it gets really difficult and why it has to be really individualized. And our stress levels are going to have to be individualized too. The amount of work that we do, you know, my work, even in comparison to where I was a year ago. So I just had my 4th child in May, and my work capacity on bench is half of what it was just 6 months ago. Half. And that's the thing, is that we have this ever evolving nature in the rest of our lives. And that's what I mean, coming back to that analogy, that the landscape is constantly shifting, that cave is constantly shifting. So we have to have those discussions with our athletes and figure things out. Like, I need to know if Shane's going to go through this very, big drinking period, or he's going to go through this really long travels, or he's going to decide, hey, it's time for me to cut. I want to do bodybuilding again. I mean, I need to know that, because all those things influence how much stress I'm going to program, up or down. Or do we stay the same and watch and see what happens?
And you even said something there, I think, that really kind of echoes with a lot of the decision making I see, is that as a coach, you need to be. We're just talking to another coach. We were talking to another coach recently about this, that you need to have be able to be top down and bottoms up at the same time. That when you do need to react to things, you do need to have that toolbox, or at least that kind of understanding that if someone is performance is still going up, why are we changing this block? Okay, while your standard time to peak is 3 weeks, 4 weeks, we're week 4 now, and we've seen you go up from 2 to 3 to 4, and we're still in the pocket. So let's carry on. And I think even just trusting, I think as coaches, we often make, and I say this all the time, we often make changes just to make ourselves feel like we're doing a job. Like, someone's paying you money, someone's, hard efforts going into this, and then you're sitting at the other end of a video and you're going, Jesus, great work there last week. We're actually going to do the same thing, and so we'll just add a little bit of weight there to the top set and you drive on. Thanks very much. And it's hard, because you just want to feel like you're making a difference. We're all I think the vast majority of coaches are in coaching for the right reasons, and you want to feel like you're doing something. You want to give that value. You want to make the person feel like they're paying you to do something. And even in that, I suppose it's a skill. Maybe me myself, I need to learn to not be so insecure and maybe be a bit more confident in that. But I think that's hard, and that is something I think I would hope people listening to this, when they hear a seasoned coach like you saying that.
Well, I'll just jump on that for a second, give you a little bit more of my history, because I know we wanted to get into that a bit. I'm trying to make sure I hit the show notes, okay? I'm hitting the checks for you. So I got started in lifting weights as a way to lose weight, okay? So I did not get into this thinking, hey, bodybuilding, powerlifting. Nope. I was very overweight and had some health conditions, and I was in my early 20s, and doctor was like, hey man, you got to do something, because this is not good. And that was driven by pain, right? I was pushed by pain to make a change. And what happened was I fell in love with lifting weights. I fell in love with it. I fell in love with the way that it felt, how I looked, how I was performing. I had somebody turn to me and say, hey man, you've lost all this weight. I think by the time I was done, I lost 60, 70 pounds, something like that. And someone was like, why don't you do bodybuilding? You're totally shredded and you got all this muscle. You should do a bodybuilding show. I'm like, what the heck is that? You mean the thing from Arnold's Encyclopedia, the thing I have at home that I've wore out looking at, And it's yeah, like that. I was like, I can do that without drugs? Yeah, you could. I was like, okay. And I went at it, and I loved it. I thought it was so much fun. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, by the way. And I tell that to people, if you want to do bodybuilding, it's one of the hardest things you'll ever do in your life. It's you versus you the entire time. Your brain is going to trick you. You're going to fight yourself all the way. And to get to that level of leanness, it's hard work. And I still didn't get to the level of leanness that we see in natural bodybuilding today, with the crazy striated glutes and next to death look. And it's crazy how far natural bodybuilding has come, and the physiques. It's just amazing to me. That being said, what happened was I did it, and I just thoroughly enjoyed it, did a series of shows. And then I was working with a coach he was a powerlifting coach. And he's like, you got shredded, but it's time for you to get strong. So I was like, okay, let's do it. And through that process, I had started to work with Dr. Mike Zordos and kind of got interested in powerlifting. Did my first meet, really enjoyed it. And then I was helping people to do bodybuilding. They needed something to do in the off season. So what did they do? Powerlifting. throw the t-shirt on, stop looking at yourself, get a little fat and lift some weights, and have a bunch of people cheer for you. That's what they liked. So did some powerlifting, and I found out that I was a much better powerlifting coach than I was bodybuilding coach because I was way more passionate about it. I thought it was just so much more fun. Not to say that I don't love bodybuilding. I tell everybody bodybuilding is my first love, right? So, and fast forward, I had learned quite a bit about periodization. Like I said, Dr. Mike Zordos did he coached me and mentored me. I started taking the RTS classroom when he was still doing it with Mike. So he had a course and Mike Tashir. And what happened was I just got hooked on Mike Tashir's stuff and started using it for the athletes that I coached and saw tremendous success. And this was before emerging strategies. And then he came out with emerging strategies. And I said, this is the coolest thing that I've seen, because I had started to navigate in that direction myself. As I was coaching athletes, I started questioning, well, why do we have to do a volume block 6 months out from a meet? I got this person that their 1RM goes up. Like if we do a mock meet at the end of a volume block, their 1RM goes up every time reliably. So why am I doing a peaking block before a meet if they don't seem to benefit from it? And I started questioning that. Like, hey, this athlete seems to do really well when we give them 5-6 sets of 70%, for 8 reps. And they benefit from it. Whereas I have this other athlete where we give them 85% doubles and their 1RM goes through the roof. So why are we doing a bunch of volume work when they get worse? Why are we doing that? So I was already questioning this. And I think that that's kind of sort of my evolution, where Mike Tashir gave permission basically to me. I felt like he gave me permission to not do the thing that everybody else was doing, to break the sort of I need to do competition lift 3 times a week sort of mentality. And it needs to be, 8s on Monday, 6s on Wednesday, and 4s on Friday. Like I can break that mold. And I found that athletes could benefit from that they got better, and it helped me to individualize training. Now, one of the challenges that I had with that was I almost went all the way in the other direction of I had no long-term plan, right? You were talking about this top-down and bottom-up periodization. So as I was implementing emerging strategies initially, I almost had no plan for the long term, in that I would have a conversation with the athlete and it was like, okay, well, what's the next thing that we should do? This seems like a good idea. Okay, let's go with it based on what we saw in this last block. At the same time, that didn't always prepare athletes for competition the way that I reliably wanted to. And so what I've been over the past few years thinking about is how do we in some way marry up top-down periodization with bottom-up at the same time? So how do we analyze the blocks that give us the greatest peak in terms of the estimated 1RM and the greatest rate of gain? And how do we sequence those for an athlete leading into a meet? And for some athletes, that could be your traditional, like, hey, 2 blocks out from a meet, we're doing a bunch of volume, and the block leading into the meet, we're going to do your traditional peaking, or we're going to do a volume, strength, peaking sort of method. And yeah, that might work for some athletes, but for some, it doesn't. My best example of that, to give a concrete one, is I have an athlete who we do international competition, and he does not peak his squat going any heavier than a 4 out of 8 leading into a meet, which is very not traditional that you would expect. We do 6s in one block and 4s in the next, right into a meet. And reliably, this is the reliability piece, because we keep the microcycle consistent, because we have data on it, and we've done this strategy before, we know that his performance is going to be up. Now, it creates other problems. Okay, I don't want to say that I've solved this problem. It creates other ones, like, hey, you go to take an opener, but you haven't really taken an opener in training. So how does that work, right? The load is really heavy on your back, and how are you prepared for it? For him, it's like he would walk out this load. It was so heavy. He would go to squat and it was super fast, but he was like really nervous because it was so heavy on his back and he wasn't taking it. So we had to come up with other creative strategies. That's the bottom up piece. So top down, we've got the strategies we know are going to work. Now we've done that, but bottom up, he's presenting another problem, which is, hey, I go to walk out this heavy squat and I don't know what to do with it. It feels weird. So like as an example, I had him working in as a secondary day using squat with chains. Why? It's a super loading opportunity for him to walk out a really heavy load, but to offload some load in the bottom. It specifically prepared him for competition. We also did heavy walkouts, to prepare him for what that was going to feel like. And so that was like the creative problem solving, because we knew that having him touch 88 to 95% intensities was not beneficial for him leading into competition. For whatever reason, he just had trouble recovering from it. But if we did something like that, we honored that and gave him the solution he needed. And to me, that's like, to kind of sum up for you the way I look at emerging strategies and like periodization, that's the way to look at it, I think. You need to have a plan. You need to know where you're going. The where you're going comes from the blocks that you've done with an athlete that have some reliability. And now, if you don't have that data, unfortunately, like I just had an athlete sign up with me. He's got 6 weeks before comp. I don't have the data. I don't have that information. And so you've got to go off of probably your prior knowledge of periodization to say, what do we need? Some specificity, high intensity, skill practice, and we got to make sure we don't beat you to the ground. We do that going into comp, we're probably going to be in a good spot. But if you've got longer time with an athlete, and you've got 6 months, pay attention to those blocks that you're writing. You're going to see the greatest hits emerge. Time that before competition. And then as problems come up along the way, respond to them in a bottom-up approach and have that creativity.
Absolutely. No, I think it sounds so obvious, but I suppose you would kind of hope the coaches are at least kind of taking notes and aware of these things. I've an athlete, and he, for so long, he was cutting really, really hard into weight class. He was cutting like 5, 6, 8 kilos, rather than hovering. And throughout the entirety of the peak, he would always say, "Oh, you're holding me back here. You're holding me back here. You're holding me back here." And you're trying to draw attention to, look, you have this training stress that you're able to withstand throughout the entirety of a block, but within that, or within the kind of development block, or kind of the blocks leading into the competition cycle. And then he was kind of, throughout the entirety of the competition cycle, getting ready, he would obviously be in a diet, and that reliability of performance was completely taken out of it. And all of a sudden then he just stopped cutting for competitions, went into the weight class that he performed at, and his performance, his total, everything just shot up, and we now have predictability in performance. So I even think, while the job of the coach is to be aware of these things, I do really think there's an onus on the athletes as well to manage. Again, I hate being one of these online coaches that says manage the variables, manage what you can manage, but it is like it's a meme for a reason, I suppose, that we do know that, like you said there, when we have that predictability of performance across a developmental block or across a block leading into a competition cycle, all of a sudden then an athlete will start the competition cycle, and all of that data will go out of the window. Or the athlete will feel like they're being held back of, oh, I need to drop 10 kilos now to get this dots, or I need to whatever.
It creates, at the very least, a variable that you did not plan for.
Yeah.
And without having a plan for it, it's hard to adapt in light of new information. And that is the biggest challenge. The same would be true if we just changed the protocol of your squat. If this is the protocol we think that would be reliable, and then we change it, well, now we don't know, And listen, I say that, and I also want to tell coaches and athletes, sometimes it's the right decision, but you also have to make peace with the fact that you don't know what's going to happen. Yeah. So I had an athlete who, I'll give you an example. He has a very long time to peak, 9 weeks. It's quite long, which means you're planning almost a half year out from your meets, right? Kind of thinking about it that way. And we were trying something new, and then a meet landed up on the calendar, and it was right in the middle of a cycle that we were running like a new thing, and it was responding pretty well. And we both decided, hey, let's continue with this leading into the meet. Let's not change it because we're already in the middle of it. So let's just see it out. Well, 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later, it tanked hard. And I had a meeting with the athlete and I said, listen, we can continue with this strategy, but all the evidence seems to suggest that we're not benefiting from it anymore. Now we've got 2 choices. 3, actually. We modify this plan in some way to try to engineer a better performance, if there's a way to do that in this current plan. 2, we come up with a brand new strategy that we have no idea if it's going to work. Okay. Or we use from your data a previous training block that we've seen reliably peak you into competition. Now, look, we've only got 3 weeks to peak. I have no idea where that's going to be, but it's certainly going to be better than where we are right now. So putting that opportunity on the athlete's, sort of decision making and to say, where would you like to be?
Yeah.
Because there's pros and cons. There's risks to doing all of that. And there's no certainty here. The only certainty I have is that when we did this one block before, it was reliable and it peaked on time and we got the performance we wanted. So what we did was we used that strategy and the athlete had a heck of a meet. It was fantastic. He hit his qualifying total that he needed for a future competition. Performance was way better than we were hoping. Now, it wasn't his all-time best on all 3 disciplines, but he did hit some PRs there. And that was not going to be the case if we kept running that one strategy into the meet. And that's what I mean is that you don't have a crystal ball. You don't know what's going to happen with an athlete, but you do have some data to suggest that when someone does something, that they are going to perform a certain way. But if you're cutting into competition like you're talking about, now you've created this unshaky atmosphere to know, are you going to reliably respond to that protocol again? Like if you were doing that protocol, let's say in a surplus or at maintenance, does it still work the same way if you're in a cut? Or if you're cutting, do you have to modify the stress of that in some way, positively or negatively? Those are the questions, and you don't really know. And I think that's where the coach and athlete have to come together and make that decision and be at peace with the chances of it working and not working, and then learn from it.
No, absolutely, yeah. And it is, I suppose it does go back to that idea of trust, that it is like you said, it's trusting that the odds of success in this are maybe 40%, the odds of maybe negatively affecting performances up in 60. Do you want to flip that coin?
And sometimes it's 50-50. Sometimes it's like, hey, look, do you feel like trusting the athlete's gut? Like what I like to say is my job as a coach is I have that 10,000 square foot view, and I have the benefit of working with a lot of athletes and the experience and, prior knowledge and whatnot. The athlete has the training knowledge of themselves in the gym, their boots on the ground, that I can't possibly have. I don't know what it's like in Shane's body when he is doing a heavy set of 5 and what that feels like to him, because I'm not doing it. Like I can tell you from my experience what it feels like, but he may experience it differently. And he might have this inclination to say, John, 5s are not it, but triples are. And I feel like next cycle we should do triples. I need to listen to that in light of any other evidence that would be contrary to his opinion. I need to listen to it as a coach and go for that win. Because even if we do the triples and it doesn't work, Shane learned something about himself, right? And him learning something about himself is far more important, I think, in the long run than the E1RM at the end of that cycle. Him learning, let's say, that triples are the greatest thing since sliced bread or not, help us to have guardrails and to make decisions, which over the long haul should help us with individualization of training.
Yeah, it's even one thing I've started doing with a lot of people that I would start off coaching is just what are your rep range preferences? What do you like going heavy on? What do you hate doing? And even as a tool, while it's not going to be the be all and end all, it's like athletes, for the most part, if they've been doing it for a while, they have an idea of what has and hasn't worked, even if they're not writing everything down and collecting their time to peak. They know they have an idea. They're like, longer training blocks kind of feel shite by the end of it. Shorter training blocks feel good by the end of it. And even like, I know, and like we might laugh at that kind of anecdote of it being so simplified, but for the most part, if someone's training for a while, they've had some success, they've stuck with it, like you said, their gut probably will tell them, and it's maybe not even a guess from, they probably do know.
Absolutely. Well, Shane, do you mind if I jump in and share a little bit about you? Is that okay?
Go for it. Yeah.
Shane had a check in with me just today and was like, hey, I think I got 2 more weeks left of this. I feel like that's the shelf life of this strategy. It's kicking my butt and I'm benefiting, but I think I got 2 weeks left. I'm taking note of that. We're slotted to go longer, but I'm paying attention to the fact that he said that, because there's something he's experiencing and feeling that I'm not seeing in the data. I'm seeing performance go up. I'm seeing fatigue rated pretty well, but he's experiencing something that I can't possibly see or know. And I need to pay attention to that as qualitative data, the same as I pay attention to the quantitative data. We need both.
Yeah, and I think having that mixed methods approach to being a coach, like it's the idea of soft skills, it's the communication, it's asking the questions. And a lot of the people I'm coaching will laugh at me when I see them, but I'll always ask them, like, how's the body, how's the head? And like, it sounds stupid, but like there can be a disconnect where there can be a little bit of mental fatigue happening within a block, where someone's kind of going, oh fuck, I have to come in here now and doing 7 sets of 7 again. And even for someone to feed back to you at the end of the block, great training block, great performance, but I was going in every Tuesday dreading training, or I was coming out, those accessories, no, not the ones that not good, did them, but wasn't hitting those thresholds, or maybe wasn't concentrating as well. And even as a qualitative feedback tool, where I suppose it kind of does, maybe you as a bodybuilder and Shane as a bodybuilder, I was a really bad bodybuilder, fado, but even for someone to say, like, I can do this exercise, but I might get less of a benefit, it mightn't be as optimal, but I prefer doing a dumbbell incline fly to this machine. Why'd you like it? Just feels good, just looks good. It looks better in the Instagram reel or whatever, but it's the exercise that you're going to adhere to. It's the exercise you're going to put a little bit more effort into. And I think those kind of softer skills of kind of the handling that qualitative data, it's not the easiest thing to do, because we can kind of maybe marry into the quantitative stuff and kind of say, well, like you said, where, okay, look, buddy, performance is still going up here. You're gonna suffer through this for another 4 weeks. That in of itself is fatiguing for the athlete to come in and do something they feel like they're not able to do, or they don't want to do.
I think that Shane is a warrior, and if I told him to keep doing it, he would do it. So, there's that. So I don't want people to think like Shane's like fighting against me because I'm giving him something hard. That is not the case. But I think also hearing Shane tell me that he thinks he's got 2 weeks left and that's the shelf life of this block might be a leading indicator, right? So if we think about leading and lagging indicators, fatigue can sometimes be a lagging indicator, and psychological engagement can be a leading indicator. So what I mean by that is, typically in my experience, I'll have an athlete who, even if they're benefiting from training and they're gaining, their performance is going up, and we look at all the quantitative stuff of fatigue, right? However you track it. We used a free tool called Track, which is training recovery assessment computer, and it looks at how much fatigue you're experiencing in certain parts of your body and energy levels and things of that nature. And it spits numbers out. So it's an attempt to quantify the qualitative in a way. And what I'll typically see is the numbers in Track are trending just fine, and the performance is up, but the athlete is like, hey, I'm kind of at the end of this. Do you think that we could move on to something else? And it's like, well, I don't know, we're still benefiting, so let's keep going. And usually what happens is within a week or two, E1RM, estimated 1 rep max, tanks, or it goes down reliably. Now, we could talk about that. Is it like a self-fulfilling prophecy? You
Yeah.
know, is it the athlete says to themselves, like, oh, I'm sick of this thing, therefore I'm going to stop trying? Maybe. That's not really been what I've observed. Like, I still see athletes try, and I still track velocity data for those nerds out there that I coach that use it, like me. Being tongue in cheek, I think it's awesome. But, you know, we're still tracking that. I'm still looking at videos, and the athlete's still saying, hey, this was a single at an 8, you know, and I agree. So I think that psychological engagement is a leading indicator, and we need to pay attention to that. We know that that's true when we look at other sports, that psychological engagement in the sport itself is super important. And I think that that's so true. And actually, I got a question for both of you. Do you think, when you think back to the best squat strategy you've ever had, is it one that you kind of get fired up for? Is it one that you get kind of excited about? Or is it this thing that you dread? Like, yeah, I know we all secretly like dread training. Like, we talk about it like it's some badge of honor. Oh, gotta go do my training session now. Like, I know we do that. But like, when you think about your best squat strategy, don't you get kind of a little fired up thinking about it? Because I know I do.
Nervous. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say it's an excited type of fear.
Yeah.
Yes. I liken it to what I tell my wife when I do equip squatting. One of two things is going to happen. I'm going to stand up with this, or you're going to have to call an ambulance. And so either one of those is going to happen, and I'm going to shoot for, standing up with it, but we'll see what happens. That kind of fear is, I think, what drives a lot of us to like push our bodies beyond what we believe is our capacity, what we're capable of. And there's something about that that's exciting and fun at the same time, and scary. And I think if we looked at psychological engagement, I think that's going to trend with probably the best strategies for us in our training. Now, I don't think it's perfectly linear. Okay. I think that there's some things that suck that you got to do. Okay. I'm sure if I gave you hip thrusts, maybe Shane would like it. Lawrence, I don't think you'd like it. I don't know. I just get this feeling you wouldn't like it. But if it showed that on both of your meta block reviews that you guys need hip thrusts and I gave them to you, well, if I could make a case for why they're good for you, Lawrence, I bet you'd still do it.
Oh,
It'd suck. You'd have to like fire yourself up, but I think you'd do it, And I think that that's what it comes down to, psychological engagement, is that I don't think it's perfectly linear, but I do think that there is something to pay attention to here.
I actually do think where that's our job with that psychological engagement aspect. I think that's our job as coaches, maybe to put on your coach's hat and not be their pal. But it does come down to maybe as a coach identifying that, like the individualization, the needs of that athlete. Like, am I dealing with someone that's like my sister there, where realistically, if we get in 4 good sessions a week and she's relatively adherent to the program, she'll progress. Whereas are we talking about someone that's a elite level, like that guy that hypothetical athlete we were saying earlier, that you're just going to pull out the Game Boy, put in the program, turn it on, and then they just run the program. And I think, like you said there, like for the likes of us, putting in exercise that we probably don't like, not an issue. I'm going to do it anyway. Like John is telling me getting my glutes stronger is going to help me deadlift my squat. I'm absolutely doing it. And I think it is kind of a truism though, like that, where it is kind of catering to your audience and knowing your audience. I suppose that the caveat, I suppose, for someone listening to what we're saying is that we're probably in this context maybe talking about the more advanced lifters sometimes, while still these are concepts that can be applied to the newbies. It is kind of a like Dan said earlier, it's not a one size fit, or it's not a one size fits all kind of thing.
I heard Dr. Zordos say this one time, and I thought it was a really good one. He did a mass presentation, and he was talking about programming, and he said, you have to give people what they need, but you also have to give them some of the things that they want as well.
Yeah.
And I think that that's important. Like, Shane needs bicep curls in his plan. Like, I get it. I understand. I put him in my plan too. No hate. Okay. But does he need it for his squat to go up? Probably not. Definitely not.
No.
You know, but at the same time, if that kind of fires them up a little bit, I'll give them to them. Because this is another thing as a coach that I try to think about is like, what are the benefits and risks of doing something? One of the benefits of including something that somebody has a preference for is that they are excited to do it, which typically means they're going to do the rest of the program too. What are the risks? Well, I just had an athlete check in with me and said, hey, I had something happen at work. I've got 45 minutes to train. What do? And we've got to meet in 5 weeks. Well, I'm sorry. Like we're cutting some stuff and we're doing the bare bones. Okay. And I get it. Like that's going to be, you're going to miss some things that you want to do, but this is what we got to do right now. But training doesn't have to look like that forever. You know, maybe for the next 5 weeks is what it looks like, you know? And so I think we have to marry those things. And you're right about the psychology aspect of it. It's up to us as coaches to generate athlete buy-in. Yeah. It is.
But I think once you do have that buy-in though, that's when it is kind of when the magic happens and the juices start flowing and you get those top hits like you said earlier. Shane, is there any other kind of bits that were on that list, John?
I suppose I was going to ask. So obviously, like the client collaboration, like for a system like immersion strategies to work is like super important, right? Because like, say for example, you're coaching me and I decide to underrate on my RPEs, then the system does not necessarily work as reliably. Similar with on the lifestyle side of things, right? If again, like a few weeks ago when I was maybe dieting and my lifestyle is a little bit all over the place with travel, then again, that kind of informs it doesn't really do much for informing future programming, right? So when it does come to those like kind of situations, like, and in an ideal situation for athlete kind of data collection, like what have been some ways that you have went about that has improved kind of the reliability of the information that you collect from clients to help again inform the kind of program decisions you make together?
It's a great question. I think if we take your example, I think it helps to illustrate, I think the point you're getting at is that you were in this kind of bit of a crazy stir, like a period of time, you know, you were traveling quite a bit and you had some variables that were impacting recovery a little bit and some lack of consistency in facility, lack of consistency in schedule, things are moving all around. Now, one of the things that we could do, one decision could be to say, hey, look, let's just ignore all the data during this time period because it's not reliable. And I don't think that's a wrong thing. I don't think that's a wrong approach. I do think that it's not the approach that I would take because it is providing information. It's just not as accurate. It's not as reliable as probably other periods of time where you're at home, you're sleeping 8 to 10 hours and eating all the same foods and training at the same facilities, right? That data is probably more accurate and reliable, but the travel times also provide opportunity. And what I mean by that is, let's say you start using a different machine. You use a different piece of equipment, one you don't normally have access to, or one that you've not tried before. Or you're lifting with other people that see something that you don't typically see, and they encourage you to do something a different way on your technique. And those are things that are influencing that strategy that we should take into account. The other thing is that we can look at that block of time and say, while performance was good, I wonder how much better it would be with consistency, right? So we could repeat it again down the road, probably not right away, but repeat it again and see what we get. Now, if we get, you know, a crap block, I'm not saying that was the case for you, but let's just say like E1RM goes down on squat. Well, okay, we repeated it now. When things are a little bit more consistent, we can feel a little bit better about that data. Where it gets really tricky, Shane, is when I'm working with someone who never has a predictable life, like myself. I never have predictable sleep. I have 4 kids and it just is what it is. I don't have that sort of predictability. That being said, that's my run rate. Okay. So because of that, that should, in the long run, with all the data, wash itself out. If I consistently have an inconsistent amount of recovery and sleep, what that means is that I actually have to approach my training with a bit more understanding of autoregulation. I have to be open to autoregulation. And that might mean, hey, today you were supposed to do your comp squat. You're not ready for it. You slept 3 hours. You didn't get enough recovery. Kick it to tomorrow. It requires a greater degree of flexibility. But that doesn't mean that the data is not useful, right? So that's one of the things that I look at is it's still useful. It may not be as reliable as a period of time where you have someone who, is sleeping consistently and those sort of things. But that doesn't mean that you can't use it for future decision making. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it definitely takes both, obviously, takes perspective from the coach's end as well as from the athlete's end. Like, obviously, as an athlete, when things like that, you have to accept like what the rate of progress is also going to be like. Right, that's definitely one thing I stated to you many times through our check-ins. I was like, I'm not expecting to see my squat take off here because I know on my end I'm not doing things perfectly. But again, like, you do have to kind of accept those trade-offs, because ultimately, if you're expecting the same level of progress as like an athlete who, like at the start of our conversation, has all of their kind of outside factors taken care of, you can't really kind of compare the two. But I suppose over time you want to get those things more in line if you can control those variables, control your sleep, control your eating. Again, allow yourself to auto-regulate your training stress. So accepting that some weeks the weight is going to go up in the bar, some weeks it's going to stay the same, some weeks it's going to go down, and just allowing that to be part of the training process. But ultimately, once you were getting all those factors in check and you're seeing those kind of trends go up closer to competition, then that's the outcome that you're looking for.
Absolutely. And I think it's understanding tools too. There's certain tools that can be used in situations like this, like flexible schedules, for example. Like if you had a period of time, again, Shane, where you were traveling a lot, one of the things we could do is say, here's your primary stuff, here's your secondary work, and here's your tertiary stuff. Prioritize this. When you can, do this. And if you don't get to this, it's not going to really kill your gains. But if you can get to it, great, throw it in. Throw your rows in, throw your pull downs, your curls. Okay, cool. Right? But like comp squat, comp bench, comp deadlift, we need to prioritize it. That's a tool that we can use in a situation like that. And you're also going to be learning some really important things about yourself. You're going to learn what it's like to have a down performance, but still get under the bar anyway. That is developing psychological grit. That is incredibly important for sports performance. It's also important because even despite controlling all of the other inputs, there's going to come times when you have to take load off the bar because it's the right decision at that moment to set you up for success in the next week or the next session. And so you're learning those skills. And so that's the kind of thing that I think about is if I have this toolbox, I can't always expect to use pure emerging strategies of repeat the exact microcycle the same every single week as the tool for that situation, the way that it's taught in the course. The concepts I can use, but practicality, I have to consider the athlete's unique situation. And that might mean, hey, we're going to use an introductory week. Like I'm pretty big on intro weeks for athletes that need it. That's not stock emerging strategies, but it is one that I use. I will use progressive RPE top sets for athletes that might need that. So I'll give you an example. I was in the hospital with my son for a number of days, and I essentially did a full week. And before that was like a pivot. So call it almost 2 weeks of no competition lifts. And listen, I've been training for a long time. I'll come back. I'll be fine skill wise, but it does feel weird, right? Like if you take time off and you get back onto the bar, you're like, whoa, what the heck is this? Even though, you're doing all the same skill. And the answer to that situation, the tool that I use was a progressive RPE top set, starting out at a 5 out of 6 and increasing it till I got able to handle a 5 out of 8. I still needed to dissipate fatigue from not sleeping for almost a week in the hospital. I needed to feel what it's like to have a heavy load on my back. And actually, I had one of the best performances that I've had with literally having one set of squat a week. I only did one top set. That's it. Everything else was some other type of exercise, so like belt squat, Bulgarians, whatever. And that's not like a typical strategy that you would see at emerging strategies, but it was a tool that I used for that particular situation. And I was able to use it within an emerging strategies framework because I knew the rules and was able to break them. And so, even in these situations where we have these things come up, like I'm going to come through a period of time where that's going to happen again. Life is going to throw something at me again where I get impacted in training. But now I can pull that block out and say, hey, remember that time where you did this and this was the result? Cool. Do it again. Do it again, because that's the right tool for this situation. And sometimes it might be, more specificity, less specificity, more competition lift, more other things, training more like a bodybuilder. Sometimes I actually had this one athlete where we did almost nothing but bodybuilding training, and we did one set of squat a week, and it was the best training block we've ever done. And that just came because of the constraints he was under at that time. And sometimes you uncover that stuff and you go, wow, you know what? I might have psychologically thought like I'm missing things in training, or I'm not able to do like traditional powerlifting training. But then you look back at it and go, this was one of the best things that I ever did, because I had this opportunity to do it, because life presented me that opportunity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so much about knowing the rules of the game, like you said, and then in cases where it's like the best, and I suppose I keep using sports analogies, but the best players in the world at any sports, they tread in that grey line between breaking rules. And I think it's coaching again, like it's an analogy I'm using, but it's as a coach, it's like knowing that, look, this is not what I would do generally with athletes, or this is not what I would generally do with myself. But like in your case, where you used a linear increase in RPE over a couple of weeks, where you had a period of deload, you kind of needed to build up some acclimation to handling heavy loads again. Makes sense. You aren't going to sit in an RP5 forever, or an RP6.
Exactly.
And like it's in cases with, when you're dealing with athletes, that their life situation is not optimal. It's not like in your case where you were in a hospital, you were off the back of a pivot week, you didn't get under a comp squat for 14 days plus. That like if you're a coach and you are faced with these situations, being prepared to say like, look, this is not optimal, this is not the ideal, but it's good enough to do the job. Like I coach a couple of I coach like police officers. Their lifestyles are in some of the time brilliant, but other than that, it can be very much a case of where can we fit in sessions and how can we minimize fatigue between those sessions, and that can largely inform a lot of the decision making process. And that mightn't be forever, but it's being able to be reactive.
So I want to add to that real quick, and I know we're like blowing past our time here, but I got to say this. This is why at RTS we look at the tenets of coaching being leadership, relationship, and creativity. Leadership, it's up to me to communicate to the athlete why this is a good idea.
Yeah.
Relationship, I have to have that relationship with the athlete to be able to say, like, I understand where you're coming from. This is super frustrating that you're going through this. Leadership, here's the strategy that we're going to use, and here's why. Creativity, I need to have a toolbox big enough to handle that situation. And that was one of the things I think with taking the Emerging Strategies course, is that it provided me all of these different tools, these ways of managing these athlete situations. And one of my favorite things to do as a coach, and I would encourage other coaches to do this, is to learn from as many coaches as you possibly can. Look at all the programs, all of them, even the ones that you think like, oh, that's not going to work. Like, learn them all, because you never know when that strategy might be really beneficial. I've done some funky stuff with lifters, and it came about because we had some guardrails and we needed to do it that way. I told you my strategy of like one comp squat a week, because that's all I could tolerate, and was feeling banged up and had all this recovery debt that I had to pay off, and it paid off. Why? Because I had seen a strategy like this used before, because I used it with an athlete and it was really beneficial. So I said, hey, let's try it. This is a good situation. And as you get further and further in your coaching career, you develop those tools. But I think you have to have all three. You have to have the leadership to be able to communicate, here's what we're going to do. You have to have that relationship with the athlete first as the bedrock to be able to communicate with them. And creatively, you have to know all these different strategies to be able to decide which is the right hammer for the tool or for the time. Because there's a variety of different hammers, like you're not going to use a sledgehammer when you're trying to frame. Okay. So you've got to be able to use the right hammer.
No, I like you echo a lot of the thought process I would have around coaching, I suppose, that it is a marriage between, like, coaching does very much sit in the middle of the Venn diagram between nearly an art and a science, that while it should be very much based on evidence, founded in data, largely informing your decision-making processes. But I do think there is that element of coaching as well where it is nearly an art. It's going off of the feeling. It's going off of, well, this is my experience. This is kind of what, like you said earlier, where you as a coach, you've been in these situations before, and I think it's like you said with the 3 pillars of RTS. I think you do have a maybe, I don't know, you did it on purpose or maybe inadvertently, but it is almost a perfect Venn diagram of the 3 principles, where it's kind of saying, look, it's a science and an art at the same time. And I think that's kind of where maybe art is the wrong word, but it is definitely a hard skill versus soft skill effort, I think, is coaching. And I think you've highlighted that really, really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree with you. I think it is an art and a science. The science helps guide us. It helps to inform us, to give us better tools, more tools that seem to work for the majority of people. I'm going to say that. Okay. That is one of the biggest challenges with research, is that there are still outliers in these 8-week, 12-week, 16-week training studies. There are still people that are outliers. Super ultra responders and people that don't respond at all actually get worse. And that's where we have to live as coaches, because we're going to get both of those too, right? You're going to get the people where it's like, yep, I use this strategy and yeah, we can reliably expect them to get better. And then you're going to have the people that are going to get way better than you were expecting. Kind of scary how well they're developing. And then you're going to get the people that actually get worse. And then you have to have tools to be able to solve both of those problems.
And then you'll have the really, really bad one where you can have a hyper responder within the same block. The person could be a non-responder or get worse, and I suppose that's the scary situation. But it's I suppose it does go back to that idea of, as a coach, you just have to treat your N of 1, N equals 1 for you as a coach. And it's why I like coaching. It's decision making. It's kind of like, look, this is what all of my experience, all of the scientific community, we're all banging our heads together and we're trying to get you to be a better powerlifter. And I think that's kind of the fun of it. It's I suppose it's that problem solving element that kind of draws me to coaching anyway. That, like, if everyone lived a perfect lifestyle, if everyone had perfect training blocks, I suppose you could just use, I don't know, we'd all be sitting here trying to design algorithms or something to develop the perfect training cycle. But unfortunately, or well, fortunately for us, I suppose, that's why we have our jobs.
Oh boy, that's a whole nother episode. You guys will have to have me back on to talk about AI and coaching. In brief, I think that all the things that are being developed in this space are really cool.
Yeah.
I would like to see them developed to give coaches more timely information first. Like, it would be really cool to know that Shane is approaching 120% acute to chronic work ratio, and I ought to make sure that he's okay with that and he's not experiencing any pain, right? Like, I should be aware of those things to create a system that goes, hey, pay attention to this, or this athlete hasn't logged training, or this athlete has had some type of downturn in performance that's greater than this percentage, or, hey, this athlete experienced an increase in performance that is not predictive of where they should be. to me, that's where I could see that space going. But I'll stop there. And I do think it would be really cool to have that information, because that'll make me a better coach. Honestly, that'll free me up to coach.
Well, look,
Right? Because
we'll book you in as soon as me and Shane have done our reading on AI and AI coaching programs and apps. We'll send you a message and we'll get you back on before Christmas.
oh, you got it.
John, thanks so much. That was absolutely fantastic. I think you gave coaches, athletes, people that don't even do powerlifting but are involved in coaching or sports. I think you gave people loads to think about there. Shane, do you want to do your Shane always finishes the podcast, John. It's his moment to shine. So
He's your finisher?
Yeah.
He's the closer.
Well, John, I'm gonna have to get you to plug all the places that people can find you. So where can the audience find you if they want to know more?
Yeah, you can find me cracking the whip behind you while you squat, because, I coach you. But no, you can find me on Instagram, JohnG_RTS. That's probably the easiest place to find me. If you check out the Reactive Training Systems Instagram page, I'm constantly on there producing things. I do a question and answer period, so I would love for people who are listening to this podcast to jump on. I'm not sure when my next one is, but I usually do them every month or so. And hopefully we can continue having conversation. If you join up on the training lab, I would love for people to jump into office hours, because I jump in and answer questions all the time. And I love having conversation with athletes about their training.
Thank you very much, John, for coming on. It's a pleasure to have you. And hopefully, you help me add a few more kilos to my total, as well as people listening.
You got it. Hold me to it.
If you enjoyed the podcast, make sure to get on to John, follow himself on Instagram, follow the Reactive Training Systems page, and get on the office hours. It is a really valuable tool that you can help educate yourself a little bit more on how to get better, how to get stronger. But if you did like this podcast, do make sure to share it in a story. Make sure to leave a rating and review on the podcast platform that you're listening on. And we will catch you in the next one.